The late 90s was part of a rare time in history where you could generate hype for a video game simply by slapping the name 3D in the title. In 1996 alone, there was Sonic 3D, Bubsy 3D, and of course, Duke Nukem 3D. Now, Duke Nukem 3D didn't follow the story of a furry creature, rather that of a bulked-up, steroid-using, middle-aged man with morally questionable pastimes, but it was perhaps this more adult-focused character which helped the franchise not only make the transition from its 2D side-scroller heritage to a more open 3D world, but deliver one of the first true adult-focused games. I mean, it was so adult-focused that at the time of release, Australia refused classification, and in Germany, it was placed on the list of media harmful to young people list. Alas, none of this impacted the overall success of the game, and it was not only reviewed well, but sold very well upon release. Now, the version we're going to be looking at today is the original PC DOS version, with a focus on the single-player experience, which after playing several of the other versions, I would argue is the definitive version of the game. However, shortly after release, the game was ported to virtually all of the mainline consoles at the time, with the N64, PlayStation, and Saturn all seeing ports of the game, which were released to generally positive reviews. But the ports didn't stop there, with the Genesis receiving its own dramatically cut-down port some years later, as well as an even further cut-down version for the Tiger Electronics Game.com, which, while both novel in reflection, were released to generally unfavourable reviews. In modern times, there are no shortages of ways to play Duke Nukem 3D, with multiple ways to play it on modern consoles and hardware, but all of these are effectively a derivative of the original 1996 MS-DOS game. The first time I personally played Duke Nukem 3D was actually the shareware version released alongside the game upon release, which gave you the entire first episode to play through, a staggering amount of content for an effectively demo version of a game. Interestingly, it's also one of the last shareware games that I remember playing. I played plenty of good demos after, but nothing with the completeness of a full shareware version. Regardless, between playing that first shareware version and today, I've probably played through the game no less than 10 times on at least 3 different platforms, which is something that I can't say about many games. Story-wise, the overall narrative takes place directly after Duke Nukem 2, which sees Duke's spaceship shot down over Los Angeles while returning to Earth, revealing that aliens are attacking and kidnapping Earth's women, and it's up to Duke to save the day. To accomplish this, Duke has to battle on both Earth and in space, fighting everything from the mutilated police force to giant rocket launcher-wielding aliens and everything in between. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel, and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's kick some ass, chew some bubblegum, and head back to 1996 to remember Duke Nukem 3D. Now, there are a lot of first-person shooters released in the 90s which each had strong points of their own, but perhaps the difference with Duke Nukem 3D is that it doesn't excel at one or two particular things, rather the ability to bring together all of the core mechanics in the game really well. You have a combat system that's optimized for its environments, weapons which are designed to take advantage of the many enemies in the game, environmental storytelling that clues you into what's happening by seeing rather than reading. Honestly, I could go on, but overall it's the game's ability to bring so many things together well, which make it stand out. Now, arguably the most important 2 things in a first-person shooter are control and combat, and Duke Nukem 3D not only excels in this area, but practically set a new standard when it was initially released. The overall precision of the control feels just right for a first-person shooter, with the tight controls enabling for precision movement in the platforming sections, while the speed of movement perfectly supports the high-energy set-piece combat encounters. While games like Doom did a great job of doing this first, Duke 3D's new game engine, called the Build Engine, helped to improve on it in almost every way, mainly owing to an increase in overall graphical fidelity and therefore immersion. Combat-wise, the game is exceptionally well balanced. You have a strong roster of weapons, more on this later, as well as a great mixture of adversaries, both in the form of alien invaders as well as the environmental hazards, with each of these requiring thought as to how to approach and overcome them. Another strength of the game is in its overall pacing. The game is broken up into 3 episodes, which broadly speaking increase in difficulty as you progress. While the first level of the first episode serves as almost a tutorial of sort, the difficulty steadily rises in both enemies and puzzle design, which compounds in the second and third episodes. Even on the easier difficulty settings, Duke 3D is a challenging game, but despite the challenge, during all of my playthroughs, I never once felt frustrated at the difficulty level, which is a good indicator for excellent pacing. Now, while a lot of the gameplay elements are excellent, I do need to point out some things that don't shine quite as bright as the others. And look, there's not many. I had to actually really think about what to say here, and that's always a really good sign. The first thing that comes to mind is going to be subjective, but some of the levels can be too cryptic in their design for their own good. Case in point, there's a level in the third episode which requires a keycard to progress. You explore the level and don't spot the keycard until you find a hidden wall which contains a secret area, including the keycard. Now, I wouldn't have a problem with this if the keycard was just hidden behind the wall, but I'm not sure it can fairly be called a secret area if it's a requirement to finish the level. Truth be told, this doesn't come up a lot, and to the game's credit, it never really descended into frustration. But for a game that shines the brightest during moment-to-moment combat, it's a shame to take you away from that for an extended period of time. Now, if you're a regular viewer of the channel, my second criticism isn't going to come as a surprise, and that's of course the platforming segments. There are several areas in the game which require precision jumping between items to progress, and I don't know if it's the fact that I don't have the dexterity of a teenager anymore, or that I lack the patience to line up these almost pixel-perfect jumps, but it took me quite a while to nail some of them, which again took me out of the action. The last one, and again this is going to be subjective, is the damn flying enemies. Now, while the build engine was impressive for the time, it didn't handle rapidly moving and scaling items well, and in particular didn't render these enemies in 3D, meaning that if they were directly above you, you could hear them, take damage from them, but not easily see them. This is more of an issue on the harder difficulties, but even on the lower difficulties, in the third episode, the sheer amount of enemies can take a large chunk off your health. Of course though, Duke has a sizable arsenal to take down both flying and non-flying enemies alike. Most of the weapons generally have a primary purpose, whether it be taking on enemies from range, taking on enemies from close, or just an overall novelty factor. It means that you'll be switching up weapons a fair bit, as opposed to Doom, where you could essentially push through the whole game with just the shotgun. Not that that was necessarily a bad thing, mind you. The first weapon is Duke's trusty pistol, which despite being relatively weak compared to the other weapons in the game, there were several times I ran out of ammo for everything else except the pistol, necessitating its use. And here's a nice touch for balance. The pistol reloads after every 12 rounds, which effectively prevents you from using it like a submachine gun and adds a touch more immersion to the game. While it's certainly not my favourite weapon in the game, it is reliable and ammo is generally abundant. Next up is my favourite weapon, the shotgun. Now, this is a great weapon, both in sheer stopping power and satisfaction to use. The shotgun unsurprisingly excels at short to medium range combat, with the effectiveness dramatically dropping off when trying to use it at range. The only downside for the shotgun is the maximum ammo capacity of 50, which means that you not only need to be constantly on the lookout for more shells, but be quite deliberate in your shot selection. Overall though, it's a very fun weapon to use. Then we have the chain gun cannon, which is effectively a reskin version of the chain gun from Doom. There's not too much to really say here. Very high rate of fire and moderate damage make this a good choice. However, the ammo can deplete very quickly, with the majority of ammo pickups coming from the Enforcer enemy, which themselves take a reasonable amount of bullets to down. Next up are the explosive-based weapons, with the RPG launcher one of the most common in this category. Doing a large amount of damage and equally effective at medium to long range, perhaps the only concession of this weapon is the substantial splash damage it does to Duke at close range. But stick to using it at range and you'll be able to take out the game's more challenging opponents without allowing them to close in on you. If you do find yourself needing to deal with a group of enemies in a closer range combat encounter, the pipe bomb is generally a good choice, with the first press of the fire button rolling the pipe bomb towards the enemy and the second press detonating it. I often use this in late game in dealing with mobs of enemies to great success. As with the RPG though, it does considerable splash damage, so ensure you are far away from the explosion when you set it off. Now, one of the more novel gameplay mechanics introduced fairly early on in Duke's adventure is the ability to be shrunken down in size to aid in progression and puzzle solving. But the game takes this concept a little further as you progress and gives you your own shrinker weapon, allowing you to shrink your enemies and then squash them. Now, this sounds pretty cool, and honestly, it is, but it's not overly practical because you have about 10 seconds to squish them before they revert to full size with no ill effects, meaning that sometimes you need to charge into an area with other enemies just to get the kill. Fun, yes. Useful, not really. From novelty, we go to the most powerful weapon in the game, the Devastator, which is effectively a dual-wielded set of rocket launchers delivering massive damage with a very high fire rate. The catch being, like with a shotgun, you can only carry a very limited amount of ammo, so it's best reserved for the more higher difficulty enemies. Then we come to the most useless weapon in the game, the laser trip bomb. Now, if you like this weapon, great, power to you. I would never tell someone they shouldn't enjoy using a particular weapon. But honestly, this weapon is borderline useless in my opinion. It requires presetting a laser beam and then luring your enemies into it. Now, fair play, it does do a lot of damage, but there's just never really been a time in all of my playthroughs that this has been the best way to approach a situation. The last weapon again falls into the novelty factor, but has slightly more utility, and that's the freeze thrower. Think about a flamethrower, but instead of burning, it freezes. That's the freeze thrower. Although you need to shatter the frozen enemies to defeat them before they thaw. However, if they do thaw, they still have taken considerable damage from the freeze thrower, meaning they're a lot easier to finish off. Outside of these weapons, Duke does have his mighty boot as a melee weapon, as well as several items such as jetpacks, scuba gear, and some other unique items to help him defeat the alien threat. Overall, the weapon roster is impressive. Another area of the game that's impressive is the overall art direction and level design. Duke 3D was probably the first time in gaming that open or outdoor areas, in other words, parts of levels that are not confined to interior hallways, started feeling like real places as opposed to levels, and this really helps with the overall immersion of the game. Take for example the first level. Within a few minutes you've descended an apartment rooftop, been to an arcade, been to the movies, and even visited the movie toilets. The thing is, all of these places are well realised. You don't need a giant sign saying movie theatre because you know that you're in one. There's also an impressive amount of environments in the game. Everything from hotels to moon bases to even a movie set about a moon base. Everything feels really well curated, and combined with a solid overall art style which remains consistent throughout Duke's journey, really contributes to the overall fun factor. Sound design from Duke Nukem's one-liners to the soundtrack is all top-notch, and in fact the original Duke 3D theme song is probably my favourite gaming theme song of all time. Now I'm not going to risk the copyright strike by posting it here, but it's an energising tune which suits the game to a T. All of the enemies and environments also have a lot of unique sound effects, with the environments in particular using sound to underscore the game's many set pieces, such as the earthquakes. Overall, the graphics, sound, and overall presentation get full marks. Now, when I first played Duke 3D back in 1996, I honestly didn't think that I'd be playing this in 2023 and having the same amount of fun. Some games age better than others. Even similar first-person shooters that were masterpieces at the time, like GoldenEye and Turok for the Nintendo 64, have not aged well in both presentation and mechanics. Even with the remakes of these titles, they still don't capture that original fun factor, but that's not something I can say about Duke Nukem 3D. The game as it was in 1996 still delivers the exact same fun factor to me over 25 years later. Now, there were several subsequent games in the franchise released, both first and third person, but none of them were able to really capture the same fun factor of Duke 3D. And that's why for me, Duke 3D isn't just the best Duke game of all time, but one of the best first-person shooters of all time. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.